Take them off, or I'll have them removed for you," Judge Alan Whitmore said, his voice cutting clean through the quiet courtroom like a blade that had never been questioned before. And for a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed too loudly, because the way he said it made it sound less like a request and more like something final, something already decided. The old man at the defense table didn't respond right away. Samuel Carter sat with his back straight despite the years pressing down on his shoulders, his suit dark and worn but carefully pressed, his hands resting lightly on the table as if they had learned long ago not to waste motion. The medals pinned to his chest caught the overhead lights, not brightly, not like polished displays meant for ceremony, but in a muted, quiet way. The metal dulled with age, edges softened, ribbons slightly faded like something that had lived a life instead of being preserved behind glass. Whitmore leaned forward, irritation sharpening his features as he tapped his pen against the bench. "This is a court of law, not a stage," he continued, louder now, making sure the room heard him, making sure the old man heard him. "Those decorations are inappropriate for these proceedings. Remove them." A low murmur passed through the gallery, subtle but present, the kind of discomfort people feel when something isn't quite right, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Samuel didn't look at the judge immediately. His gaze lingered somewhere ahead, steady, distant, as if the walls of the courtroom didn't quite hold his attention the way they held everyone else's. A bailiff shifted near the aisle, waiting, uncertain whether to step in or not. Whitmore's expression tightened. "Did you hear me, Mr. Carter?" he said, his tone now edged with impatience. "Or do I need to make this simpler?" Samuel finally moved, but only slightly. His fingers brushed against the row of medals on his chest, not adjusting them, not protecting them, just acknowledging their presence, like someone might touch a photograph without realizing it. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough with age, but steady in a way that didn't invite interruption. "They? Stay," he said. The words were quiet, almost lost in the space, but they landed with a weight that didn't match their volume. Whitmore let out a short, humorless breath. "That's not how this works," he replied, leaning back as if the matter bored him now. "You don't get to decide what belongs in my courtroom." He gestured sharply toward the bailiff. "Take them." The bailiff hesitated for just a fraction of a second before stepping forward, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the floor, each step drawing more eyes, more tension into the center of the room. Samuel didn't pull back. He didn't argue. He just watched, his expression unchanged, but there was something in that stillness, something heavy, something that didn't belong to this room or this moment. In the back row, a young court clerk named Daniel Reeves had been half focused on paperwork, the case just another entry in a long list of minor disputes, but now his attention lifted fully, drawn not by the judge's voice, but by the old man's silence. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was something else entirely, something Daniel couldn't quite name, only recognize as wrong for the role the man was supposed to be playing. The bailiff reached out, fingers moving toward the first medal, and for the briefest instant, Samuel's hand rose. Not fast, not aggressive, just enough to pause the motion, and the room seemed to hold its breath again, caught between authority and something it didn't yet understand. The word hung there longer than it should have, simple and quiet, yet carrying a weight that pressed against the walls of the courtroom in a way no raised voice ever could. And for a brief moment, even Judge Whitmore did not speak, as if the interruption had not been loud enough to challenge him, but somehow strong enough to disrupt the rhythm he had been controlling since the hearing began. Then the moment passed, and irritation returned to his face, sharper now, less controlled. "Careful," he repeated, leaning forward with a thin, incredulous smile. "You are in no position to give instructions in this courtroom, Mr. Carter." His pen tapped once more, harder this time, the sound echoing like a small gavel. Strike that did not need to be official to carry authority. Those items are not sacred here. They are objects, and they will be treated as such. The bailiff shifted his stance again, uncertain, his hand still suspended inches from the metal, and for the first time, he looked not at the judge, but at Samuel, searching for something he could not explain, something that might tell him whether to continue or step back. Samuel did not move. His posture remained steady, his expression unchanged, but his eyes, clear and focused, held on the metal with a quiet intensity that made the air around it feel heavier than before. "It is already treated as such," Samuel said, his voice still low, still calm, but now carrying a trace of something deeper, not anger, not defiance, but memory, as if the meaning behind his words existed somewhere far beyond the room. Whitmore's patience snapped at that. "Enough," he said sharply. "This is not a discussion. Bailiff, remove them now." The command landed with finality, and the bailiff inhaled, bracing himself, his fingers finally closing the last inch of distance toward the metal. From his desk, Daniel Reeves felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the case file in front of him. His eyes were fixed on that small piece of metal, on the slight bend along its edge, on the way the ribbon had faded unevenly, and something about it refused to align with the judge's dismissal. It did not look decorative. It did not look optional. It looked like something that had stayed through time rather than being displayed for it. Daniel's mind reached back, uninvited, to conversations from years ago, late evenings at the kitchen table, his father speaking in quiet tones about men who never talked about what they carried because what they carried was not meant for explanation. He remembered one phrase more than anything else, spoken without emphasis, but never forgotten. If you ever see someone who treats something small like it matters more than everything around it, you stop and you pay attention, because you are not looking at the object, you are looking at the story behind it. The bailiff's fingers brushed the metal at last, and the contact was so light it should not have meant anything. Yet Samuel's hand moved again, not to stop him, but to rest gently over the row of ribbons, a protective gesture so subtle it almost went unnoticed, except that this time, the entire room felt it. The movement was not forceful. It did not need to be. It carried a finality that words could not reach, a boundary drawn without raising a voice. Whitmore rose slightly from his seat, frustration now fully visible. "Are you refusing a direct order from this court?" he demanded, his tone rising, pushing against the silence that no longer belonged to him. Samuel finally looked up at him fully, meeting his gaze for the first time since the exchange began, and in that moment, the distance between them was no longer about position or authority, but about something far older, something measured not in titles, but in weight carried and time endured. "No, sir," Samuel said quietly. "I am reminding you that some things were never meant to be taken off." The words settled into the room, and for the first time, even those who did not understand them felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the line between what was allowed and what was right had just been drawn, and no one in the room was entirely sure which side they were standing on anymore. The room did not react all at once, but the shift was there, quiet and spreading, like a pressure change no one could see, but everyone could feel, and Judge Whitmore felt it most of all, not as understanding, but as resistance, something subtle pushing back against the certainty he had carried into this hearing. He straightened in his chair, his expression tightening as if to force the moment back into order. "You are not in a position to define what belongs in this courtroom," he said, each word measured, controlled, but edged with something sharper now, something closer to irritation than authority. "You are here to answer for your actions, not to lecture this court on symbolism." Samuel Carter did not respond immediately. His hand remained lightly over the metals, not gripping them, not shielding them in any obvious way, but present, steady, as if the gesture itself was enough. His eyes lowered briefly, not in submission, but in reflection, as though he were looking at something far older than the polished wood and bright lights surrounding him. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm weight, unchanged by the rising tension. "I am not asking for anything," he said. "I am only keeping what was given." The simplicity of the statement did not resolve anything, but it deepened the silence that followed, a silence that no longer felt like compliance, but like hesitation, as if the room itself had begun to question the direction it was moving in. In the back, Daniel Reeves shifted slightly, his attention no longer divided, his focus locked entirely on the exchange unfolding in front of him. The more he watched, the more the details refused to align with the narrative the judge was trying to impose. Samuel did not act like someone trying to impress, or persuade, or even defend himself in the usual sense. There was no urgency in him, no visible concern for how he appeared to the people around him. Instead, there was a stillness that felt deliberate, practiced, the kind of composure that did not come from confidence alone, but from experience that had already measured far greater stakes. Daniel's thoughts moved quickly now, connecting fragments he had not realized he remembered, small details that had seemed insignificant before. The way Samuel had said they stay, not as a challenge, but as a fact. The way he had reacted to the metal being touched, not with anger, but with something closer to recognition. The way he carried himself, not like a man trying to hold on to relevance, but like someone who had long ago stopped needing it. Daniel glanced down at the case file in front of him, flipping it open with careful, quiet movements, scanning the basic information again, the name, the age, the address, all of it ordinary, almost deliberately so. But there was nothing in those lines that explained what he was seeing. Nothing that explained the weight behind such a simple refusal. His hand moved almost on its own, reaching for his phone beneath the desk, shielding it from view as he unlocked the screen. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, aware of the risk, aware that stepping outside the process, even briefly, could be questioned, but the feeling in his chest did not ease, and the words from years ago pressed forward again, insistent, impossible to ignore. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if it involves someone who carries silence like that, you do not wait for permission to find out why. Daniel typed quickly, searching for a name he had not thought about in years, someone his father had trusted, someone still connected to the kind of answers this room did not have. Across the courtroom, Judge Whitmore leaned forward again, his patience thinning further, unaware that the balance of the situation had already begun to shift beyond his control. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice rising just enough to cut through the quiet once more. "Remove them, or I will have you held in contempt." Samuel lifted his gaze again, meeting the judge's eyes without hesitation, and though he said nothing this time, the silence he offered carried more certainty than any argument, and somewhere in that silence, the first thread of something larger had already been pulled, even if no one in the room yet understood what it would unravel. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, not the kind that comes from confusion, but the kind that builds when something important is about to surface and no one yet knows how to stop it. And in that fragile space between command and consequence, the bailiff's hand made contact again, this time not tentative, but committed, fingers brushing firmly against the edge of the metal pinned to Samuel Carter's chest. The metal shifted slightly under the pressure, just enough to catch the overhead light at a different angle, and in that small movement, something changed in Samuel's expression, not outwardly, not in a way most would notice, but inside, where memory does not ask for permission before returning. The courtroom dissolved for him, not completely, but enough that the polished wood and sharp voices faded into something distant, replaced by a different kind of air, heavier, warmer, carrying the faint scent of dust and fuel, the low hum of machinery somewhere beyond sight, and the weight of a moment that had never really left him. His fingers tightened just slightly over the metals, not in resistance, but in recognition, as if the past had reached forward and touched him first. The edges of that bent piece of metal were not imperfections to him. They were markers, quiet evidence of a time when everything had been uncertain except the decisions that had to be made without hesitation. A voice, not from the courtroom, but from somewhere far older, echoed faintly in his mind, steady, urgent, trusting, the kind of voice that does not question when it asks something of you because it already knows the answer. Samuel did not close his eyes, but the shift was there, the way his breathing slowed, the way his posture seemed to settle deeper into something anchored far beyond the present. Back in the courtroom, the bailiff felt it again, that same hesitation creeping up his arm, a subtle instinct telling him that what he was touching was not just an object, and for a brief second, his grip loosened without him meaning to. Judge Whitmore noticed the delay immediately. "Do not hesitate," he snapped, his voice sharper now, cutting through whatever unseen current had begun to form. "Remove them." The command landed harder this time, not just as instruction, but as a demand to restore control over a moment that was slipping. The bailiff swallowed, tightening his hand again, but the confidence from before was gone, replaced by something uncertain, something that did not belong in a place defined by clear authority. In the back, Daniel Reeves watched closely, his phone still hidden in his hand, The message he had sent only seconds ago already feeling heavier than he expected. He did not know what answer would come, or if it would come in time, but he knew now that the question itself had been necessary. His eyes returned to Samuel, and for the first time, he noticed the smallest detail that made everything else fall into place. The way the old man's thumb rested near the edge of that bent metal, not by accident, but by habit, like someone who had touched it 1,000 times before without thinking. That was not performance. That was memory. The kind that does not fade with years, only settles deeper into the person who carries it. Samuel's voice came again, softer this time, not directed at the judge, not even fully directed at the room, but present all the same. That one, he said quietly, was never meant to look perfect. The words did not explain anything, but they carried a weight that made explanation unnecessary, and for a moment, even the judge did not interrupt, not because he understood, but because something in the tone resisted interruption. Then, just as quickly, Whitmore leaned forward again, determined to reassert control. "That is irrelevant," he said, dismissing the statement with a sharp motion of his hand. "What matters is compliance." But even as he spoke, the certainty behind his words felt thinner, stretched against something he could not see, something that had already begun to move beyond the boundaries of his courtroom, carried quietly through a message sent from the back row, through a name that was no longer just a name, but a signal, traveling faster than anyone in the room could follow, toward a place where it would not be dismissed so easily. The courtroom still existed around him, but for Samuel Carter it had already begun to drift, not in a way anyone else could see, but in the quiet space where memory does not ask permission before returning, and the moment the bailiff's fingers pressed against that bent piece of metal, the distance between now and then collapsed without warning. The overhead lights faded into something harsher, brighter, the air no longer controlled and still, but thick with heat that clung to the skin, carrying the scent of dust, oil, and something metallic that never quite left once it settled in. The quiet murmur of a courtroom gave way to a different kind of sound, not loud, but constant, the low hum of engines idling somewhere close, the distant thump of rotors turning slow and heavy in the air, each rotation measured, deliberate, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Samuel was no longer sitting. He was standing, younger, steadier, his hands sure in a way that came from necessity, not confidence. The ground beneath him was uneven, rough, marked by use and movement, and everything around him carried a sense of urgency that did not need to be spoken aloud. A voice reached him then, close, strained but controlled, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned to give orders without raising it, someone who understood that calm mattered more than volume. "Carter," the voice said, firm, steady, cutting through everything else without effort. Samuel turned toward it, not slowly, not dramatically, just as he had been trained to do, direct, focused, aware. The man standing a few feet away was younger than Samuel remembered him now, his uniform marked but not broken, his posture upright even under pressure, his eyes sharp despite the strain behind them. There was no introduction needed, no explanation exchanged, because in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was what had to be done next. Samuel's gaze dropped briefly to the small piece of metal in his hand. Not yet a medal, not yet anything official, just a fragment, rough at the edges, imperfect in every way that mattered to people who cared about appearances. But in that moment, it carried a weight far beyond its size. It had been pressed into his hand with quiet insistence, not as a reward, not as recognition, but as something else entirely, something closer to a promise. "Keep it," the voice had said then, quieter now, but no less certain. "Not for what it looks like. For what it means." Samuel did not question it. He did not need to. He closed his hand around it, feeling the edges, the shape, the reality of it, grounding himself in something that would not change no matter how much everything else did. The memory did not linger. It never did. It came in fragments, sharp and complete, then receded just as quickly, leaving behind only the weight it carried. Back in the courtroom, the bailiff's hand was still there, still touching the metal, but now it felt different, as if the object itself held more than the room could account for. Samuel's breathing remained steady, unchanged to anyone watching, but his fingers shifted slightly, resting more firmly over the row of medals. not in defiance, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement of something that had already been decided long ago. Across the room, Daniel Reeves felt his phone vibrate softly against his palm, the response coming faster than he expected, faster than it should have, and when he glanced down, the single line on the screen was enough to drain the last of his uncertainty away. He looked up immediately, his eyes moving back to Samuel, then to the judge, and for the first time since the hearing began, he understood that whatever was unfolding here had already moved beyond the control of the man behind the bench, even if that man had not realized it yet. Daniel Reeves did not look at the message for long, but it was enough, more than enough, because the response did not come back with confusion or delay. It came back sharp, immediate, and unmistakable, a single line that carried urgency without needing explanation, and in that instant, the quiet doubt he had been holding on to disappeared completely. He lifted his eyes slowly, scanning the room again, but this time he was not seeing a routine hearing unravel. He was seeing something else entirely, something already in motion beyond the walls of the courtroom. At the bench, Judge Whitmore mistook the growing silence for hesitation, not realization, and his impatience hardened into something colder. "We are done entertaining this," he said, his voice firm, attempting to anchor the room back to procedure. "Bailiff, remove the items." Now, the command landed with force, but the effect was different this time. The bailiff did not move right away. His hand was still near the medals, but no longer touching them, as if something invisible had drawn a boundary he could not quite explain. His eyes flicked briefly toward Samuel, then toward the judge, caught between instruction and instinct, and for the first time since stepping forward, he looked uncertain of which one to follow. Samuel remained still, his hand resting lightly over the medals, his posture unchanged, but the air around him felt heavier now, as if the memory he carried had not fully receded, as if a part of it had followed him back into the present and settled into the space without asking permission. Across the room, Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his mind moving quickly, not with panic, but with clarity, connecting the response he had received with the man sitting at the defense table. The name Samuel Carter was no longer just a name on a file. It was a signal, one that had triggered something far beyond this room, and whatever had been set into motion was already moving faster than anyone here could stop. He glanced toward the entrance of the courtroom, not because he expected anything yet, but because he understood now that something would come. Back at the bench, Whitmore leaned forward again, his voice rising, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the hesitation. "Do you require assistance?" he asked the bailiff, though the question was not really a question at all. It was pressure, applied directly, pushing for compliance. The bailiff inhaled, his shoulders tightening as he forced himself to move again, his hand extending once more toward the medals, slower now, more deliberate, as if every inch of distance carried more weight than it should. Samuel's eyes followed the motion, calm, steady, but this time there was something else behind them, not resistance, not fear, but recognition, as if he already knew how this moment would end, even if no one else did. "You do not need to do that," Samuel said quietly, his voice even, not raised, not pleading, simply stated. The bailiff paused again, the words landing with a certainty that did not invite argument. Whitmore's expression hardened immediately. "He does," the judge replied sharply, "because this is not your decision to make." The tension tightened once more, but beneath it, something else had begun to shift, something subtle but undeniable, like a current changing direction beneath still water. Daniel felt it clearly now, his attention fixed on the doorway, his pulse steady but elevated, not from fear, but from anticipation, because the message he had received had not been a question, it had been a confirmation, and confirmations do not arrive without consequences. In the quiet space between the judge's command and the bailiff's next movement, the room held its breath again, but this time, it was not waiting for compliance. It was waiting for something else, something that had already been set in motion the moment a name had been spoken and recognized by the right person. The moment did not announce itself with noise or movement. It arrived quietly, almost respectfully, with the soft click of the courtroom doors opening behind the gallery, a sound so ordinary that most people did not turn at first, not until the subtle shift in posture from those closest to the entrance began to ripple forward, one person straightening, then another, as if something unseen had just entered the room and demanded acknowledgement without a single word. Daniel Reeves saw it immediately. His eyes had already been fixed on that doorway, waiting, and when it opened, he did not need to see clearly to understand what was happening. The response he had received had not been delayed. It had been acted on. The bailiff froze again, his hand suspended just inches from Samuel Carter's medals. But this time the hesitation was not internal. It was external, drawn from the sudden change in the room, the quiet shift that made continuing feel impossible without knowing why. Judge Whitmore frowned, irritation flashing across his face as he followed the line of attention toward the back, clearly annoyed that his courtroom had been interrupted without his permission. "What is the meaning of this?" he began, his voice rising slightly, but the question did not carry the same authority it had only seconds ago, because by then, the figure had already stepped fully inside. The man who entered did not rush. He did not need to. His presence carried its own pace, steady and controlled, each step measured as he moved down the aisle, his uniform precise, his bearing unmistakable even to those who did not recognize rank on sight. Conversations did not start. They stopped. Chairs shifted quietly as people instinctively made space, not out of instruction, but out of recognition of something they could not quite name, but immediately respected. Samuel Carter did not turn right away. He did not need to. Something in the air had already told him enough. His posture remained unchanged, but there was a subtle release in his shoulders, not relaxation, but acknowledgement, as if a long-awaited moment had finally caught up with him. The man reached the center of the room and stopped, his gaze moving first not to the judge, but to the defense table. For a fraction of a second, the room held completely still. Then, without hesitation, without announcement, he stepped forward, closing the remaining distance with calm precision, and came to a stop directly in front of Samuel. The silence deepened, no longer uncertain, but absolute. Judge Whitmore rose from his seat, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion, then to something less certain, something that had no clear place in his usual control. "Sir, this is an active proceeding," he said, his tone attempting to recover authority, but the words lacked weight now, thin against what had just entered the room. The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at Samuel Carter, his expression composed, steady, but carrying a depth that did not belong to casual recognition. And then, in a motion so precise it felt almost ceremonial, he straightened fully and brought his hand up in a crisp, unmistakable salute. The sound did not come from the movement itself, but from the reaction it triggered, a collective stillness so complete it felt like the room had stopped breathing. The bailiff's hand dropped instantly away from the medals. Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the edge of his desk, not in surprise, but in confirmation of everything he had already begun to understand. And Samuel, for the first time since the hearing began, lifted his hand in return, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined every moment before it, as if this exchange had never been in question, only delayed. The salute held for a moment that felt longer than it was, not because of the motion itself, but because of what it meant, and when the man lowered his hand, the room did not return to normal. It did not relax or shift back into routine. It stayed suspended, caught between what it had been and what it had just become. The man turned then, slowly, deliberately, his gaze moving from Samuel Carter to the bench, and in that transition, the entire balance of the room followed him. Judge Whitmore remained standing, but the certainty that had defined his posture earlier was gone, replaced by something less stable, something searching for ground that was no longer there. "You will identify yourself," Whitmore said, attempting to regain control, but the words came out thinner than intended, lacking the force they once carried. The man's expression did not change. "General Edward Holloway," he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying across the room without effort, and the name alone settled into the space with weight that required no repetition. A quiet ripple moved through the gallery, not loud, not disruptive, but unmistakable, the kind of reaction that comes when recognition arrives all at once. Holloway's eyes remained on the judge, steady, unchallenging, but firm in a way that did not invite dismissal. "This proceeding will pause," he continued, not as a request, not as a demand, but as a statement of fact. Whitmore opened his mouth to respond, but for a brief second, nothing came out, and that pause, small as it was, carried more meaning than anything he could have said. Holloway stepped slightly to the side then, his presence still anchoring the room, but his attention shifting back to Samuel Carter. He looked at the medals, not quickly, not in passing, but with a level of attention that transformed them from objects into something acknowledged, something understood. "Those stay exactly where they are," Holloway said quietly, and the words did not echo. They settled, final and complete. No one moved. Not the bailiff, not the clerk, not the people in the gallery. Even Whitmore did not interrupt this time. The shift had already happened, and everyone in the room felt it, even if they could not explain it. Holloway straightened again, turning once more toward the bench, and now his voice carried something more, not anger, not confrontation, but clarity. "You are looking at a man who has already carried more than this room will ever ask of him," he said. "Those medals are not decoration. They are memory. They are responsibility. And they are earned." The words did not raise his volume, but they filled the space completely, leaving no room for argument. Whitmore's grip on the edge of the bench tightened slightly, a small, involuntary motion that did not go unnoticed, and for the first time since the hearing began, he did not speak immediately. The authority he had relied on had not been taken from him, but it had been placed into context, and that context was larger than his courtroom. Samuel remained seated, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, but there was a quiet finality in the way he sat, as if the moment had resolved exactly as it was always going to. In the back, Daniel Reeves exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest releasing not in relief, but in understanding. He had not stopped something from happening. He had simply recognized it early enough to witness it clearly. The courtroom stayed silent, not because it was commanded to be, but because there was nothing left to fill it with. And in that silence, the meaning settled fully, not spoken aloud, but understood by everyone present. That respect does not come from position, and it cannot be enforced by order. It is carried, quietly, over time, and when it is finally seen, it does not ask permission to be recognized.